The sun rose lazily over the thatched rooftops of the village of Kwatile, painting the clay paths gold as the early morning drums echoed in the distance. Smoke from cooking fires curled into the sky, blending with the scent of roasted maize and wildflowers. In the midst of this rural rhythm lived Zanele, a girl whose beauty was spoken of even in neighbouring villages. Her skin was the deep brown of rich earth after rain, her eyes wide like the river's curve, and her voice held the calm of moonlit nights. But it wasn't just her beauty that made her known. It was the kindness in her every word, the quiet way she helped old women carry firewood and soothed crying children with lullabies her late mother had taught her. Her home sat on the edge of the village, surrounded by pawpaw trees and wild aloe. Inside lived her father, Makulu Dlamini, a well-respected man known for his wisdom and calm temper. Since the passing of Zanele's mother, her world had tilted. The warm silence once filled with laughter and song had become a place of careful footsteps and lingering stares. Her stepmother, Lindiwe, was a woman of sharp eyes and a tighter mouth, and her daughter, Nomvula, though barely a year older than Zanele, carried herself like a queen without a throne. Nomvula was beautiful too, in a colder, more severe way. Where Zanele's charm was effortless, Nomvula chased admiration like a lioness after prey. She watched Zanele with a tightness behind her smile, her compliments often dipped in honeyed poison. "You always wear your hair like that?" she would ask, tilting her head. "I suppose it works, if you're not trying too hard." Zanele rarely responded. She had learned silence was sometimes softer than argument, but she noticed how her clothes sometimes went missing, how the chores she finished were redone with snide remarks, how her father's affection was slowly redirected with subtle manipulation. In the village, people spoke in hushed tones of ancestors and omens. Every full moon, the Sangoma read bones by the river, and even the boldest men bowed their heads when they passed the sacred fig tree near the forest. Children were warned not to whistle at night, not to speak ill of the dead, and not to envy, for envy, they said, was the seed from which curses bloomed. Zanele, for all her grace, felt the weight of something unspoken pressing in around her. A quiet shift in the air, a shadow that seemed to follow her just behind the flame of every candle. Nomvula's gaze grew colder by the day, her smiles tighter, and the gap between kindness and cruelty thinner. Zanele didn't know yet, but the fire that flickered in Nomvula's heart had already started to burn, and soon it would scorch everything in its path. In Kwatile, beauty was often spoken of in whispers, as though it was both blessing and burden. For Zanele, it had always been a quiet thing, noticed in sidelong glances, praised by elders during harvest dances, admired by women as they braided each other's hair in the shade. But as she grew into herself, her beauty stopped being a gentle breeze. It became a wind that stirred hearts and unsettled the peace around her. Men began lingering too long near the market stalls where she shopped. Young hunters returned from the bush with gifts of beaded bracelets and shy smiles, hoping for her attention. Even the old widowers grinned wider when she passed, as though her presence reminded them of the lives they once had. But Zanele moved through it all like flowing water, kind, but untouchable. It wasn't long before word of her beauty travelled beyond Kwatile to the nearby kingdom of Embo. There Prince Thabani, heir to the throne, heard tales of a village girl whose beauty rivaled the moon and whose heart shone brighter. Known for his charisma and strength, Thabani had refused many noble daughters, but the stories of Zanele stirred something in him. When the royal messenger arrived in Kwatile to announce a festival in honour of the ancestors, with the prince declaring he would choose a bride among the maidens, the village erupted in excitement and envy. Nomvula's hands clenched the moment she heard the news. Her mother, Lindiwe, immediately began plotting. They bought new fabrics from the traders who came from the mountains. Lindiwe braided Nomvula's hair with cowrie shells, and whispered that her daughter was destined to be queen. But no matter what Nomvula wore, her eyes always flicked towards Zanele, watching her in the mirror, mimicking her walk, trying on her earrings in secret. "Just because she has a pretty face," Nomvula hissed one night, "doesn't mean she deserves everything." Zainal heard but said nothing. She had grown used to the barbs. What she hadn't expected was the look Thabani gave her when he arrived in the village for the festival preparations. Dressed in royal beads and a leopard print cloak, he walked through the crowd with ease. But when he saw Zanele, his steps slowed, his gaze lingered. He spoke to her with warmth, laughing at her modest replies and asking for her thoughts on things most men ignored. The entire village noticed. Nomvula noticed. In the days leading up to the festival, the air grew tight inside Zanele's home. Every gesture from Nomvula came sharper, every glance from Lindiwe colder. Chores doubled, meals were withheld. Even Makulu Dlamini, their father, seemed distant, distracted by the thought of a royal union he could no longer control. Zanele began to feel the weight of her beauty, not as a gift, but as a burden. It had awakened admiration, but also hatred. It had opened doors, but behind them lurked jealousy with teeth. And as the festival drums grew louder in the distance, so did the quiet, burning storm within Nomvula. The night before the festival arrived like a slow, tense breath. Kwatile was alive with music and movement, lanterns hung from trees, and the scent of roasted meats and marula wine filled the air. But in the Dlamini household, the quiet was heavy. Zanele sat near the hearth, mending the hem of her dress in the dim glow of a clay lamp. Her heart beat with a strange rhythm, half hope, half warning. She had seen the look in Nomvula's eyes that morning, not just envy, but something colder, something ancient. Lindiwe had been quieter than usual too, whispering to her daughter in corners, their glances sharp as spear tips. That night Zanele went to bed early, her body weary from the day's preparations. Her father had already retired to the back hut, unaware of the whispers in the dark. The moon was thin above the village, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the yard. Inside the kitchen, Nomvula moved with silent purpose. She lit the fire under a large pot of oil, pretending to prepare food for the early morning. But her mind wasn't on breakfast. Her hands trembled with rage and fear, her heart pounding with the echo of her mother's words. "If she's gone, you'll be the only one he sees." The oil hissed and spat as it reached a boil. Nomvula gripped the pot with cloth-wrapped hands, her breath quick and shallow. 1 step, 2 steps. Down the narrow hallway to the sleeping room where Zanele lay, bathed in the soft orange light of a dying candle. For a moment Nomvula paused. Zanele's face was calm in sleep, the corners of her mouth slightly turned as if she were dreaming of something kind, something innocent. Nomvula's grip tightened. She whispered one word, maybe a prayer or maybe a curse, and tipped the pot. The scream that followed tore through the night like lightning splitting a tree. It woke the chickens, made dogs howl, and sent villagers running toward the Dlamini home. Flames caught on the edge of the sleeping mat, casting the room into chaos. Zanele thrashed, her face searing, skin bubbling, the world a blur of pain and fire. Lindiwe arrived first, dousing the flames with water, screaming for help. Nomvula stood to the side, eyes wide, hands trembling, her face twisted into a mask of forced horror. "It was the fire!" she cried. "She must have left it burning in the kitchen. The oil spilled. It was an accident." The villagers helped carry Zanele out, her face wrapped in soaked cloth, her body limp from the pain. Her father held her close, wailing like a man possessed. No one questioned the story. After all, accidents happened. Fires were common. Oil and flames didn't mix well. That was the truth they accepted, because the real truth was too dark, too cruel to believe. But Nomvula knew, and as the village turned back to their homes, she stood under the cold stars, watching the smoke rise, her heart pounding. She had burned Zanele. And Zanele was still alive, The days that followed were a blur of pain and silence. Zanele lay in her father's hut, wrapped in medicinal leaves and prayers, her face bandaged in thick white cloth soaked in herbs. The village healer came daily, applying ointments that stung like fire. Every touch reminded her of the night everything changed. The girl who once glowed with laughter and light now winced at her own reflection in the water bowl. When the bandages came off weeks later, the gasps said more than words ever could. Her once smooth skin was now scarred and uneven, twisted by the path of fire. Her left eye was swollen and half-lidded, her cheek pulled tight like leather left too long in the sun. Her beauty, the thing that had once made hearts flutter, was gone, replaced by a mask of ruin. Her father tried to comfort her, but his voice always broke. Lindiwe kept her distance, offering food and herbs, never apologies. And Nomvula wore pity like a polished jewel, offering sympathy in front of others, but flashing a smug glint when no one was watching. "You must rest," she would say sweetly. "It's best not to be seen too soon." The festival arrived like thunder. Drums rolled through the village, men painted their faces, women wore their brightest wraps, and the air buzzed with celebration. Prince Thabani returned, cloaked in royal blue, his smile as golden as the sun above. He walked among the women, choosing candidates for the bridal ceremony. Zanele stood at a distance, veiled and hidden beneath a shawl, her heart a stone in her chest. When Thabani passed her by without a second glance, she felt the final crack in her spirit. It wasn't his fault. How could he know her behind this scarred face, this broken shell? But it still hurt, deeply. Nomvula, dressed in gold and ivory, was radiant. She bowed low before the prince, smiling with a perfect curve of lips and a practiced sparkle in her eyes. When her name was announced as one of the chosen candidates, the village erupted in cheers. People clapped her back, praised Lindiwe, and whispered that greatness had come to their doorstep. No one spoke of Zanele anymore. She became a ghost in her own home, eating alone, speaking to no one. The children who used to follow her now pointed and whispered. The women who once asked her for advice now avoided her shadow. In the quiet hours of night, she sat by the embers of the hearth, staring into the fire that had changed everything. Her dreams of love, of motherhood, of dancing barefoot under moonlight turned to ash. Her heart ached not just from pain, but from the betrayal, the injustice, and the heavy truth that beauty had been both her blessing and her curse. And so, in the silence of her exile, something inside Zanele hardened. She did not yet know it, but from those ashes something fierce would rise. Not the soft girl of yesterday, but something stronger, something forged in fire. The wind howled low through the trees the night Zanele vanished. She left nothing behind but silence. No goodbyes, no explanations, just the faint print of bare feet in the dust, heading toward the forbidden edge of the sacred forest. The same forest mothers warned their children about. The place where spirits whispered, where the air was thick with old magic, and even the bravest hunters walked in with charms tied to their wrists. Zanele walked alone, the moon a pale guide above her. Her shawl clung to her like a second skin, her feet bleeding from sharp stones and thorny underbrush. But she didn't stop. Her heart was raw. Her face throbbed with the reminder of fire and betrayal. Her soul was hollowed out, carved by loss. Deep within the forest, past the fig trees and the ancient stones where no paths were marked, she collapsed by a stream, unsure if she would ever rise again. That was where the old woman found her. Maziwa. She moved like shadow and smoke, her bones wrapped in layers of cloth and beads, her eyes sharp with a knowing that could slice through lies. Some called her a witch, others said she spoke to the dead, but all agreed. She was powerful and dangerous. Zanele, too weak to run, met her gaze without fear. What else was there to lose? "You came seeking death," Maziwa said, crouching beside her, voice like dry leaves. But death has no interest in broken things. Zanelle's lips trembled. Then what does? The old woman smiled, wide, toothless, and cruel. Power. Power sees the broken and says, "Good, now we begin." That night, under the twisted arms of ancient trees, Zanele was taken to Maziwa's hidden dwelling, a hollowed baobab tree lit by blue flames and guarded by charms that buzzed like angry wasps. She was given bitter herbs to drink, her wounds reopened and cleaned with smoke and salt. But Maziwa's healing was not gentle. It demanded something in return. "I can make you whole," she said, tracing the scars on Zanele's face. "Not as you were, but as you were meant to be. The world burned you, child. Do you want to burn it back?" Zanele hesitated. "Yes," she whispered. So the old woman began the work. Days turned to weeks. Zanele learned the language of fire and smoke, how to listen to the voices of the wind, how to call on the ancestors whose bones lay beneath the earth. She danced barefoot over hot coals until the pain stopped mattering. She held burning stones in her hands without flinching. She spoke her anger aloud to the trees, and the trees listened. Her body grew stronger, her mind sharper. Her heart, once soft and full of hope, grew hard with purpose. Maziwa watched her with a satisfied glint. "The girl who was burned is gone," she said one night as Zanele stood tall before the flames. Zanele nodded. "She died in that house. I am what rose from her ashes." And far away in the village of Kwatile, the fire that had once destroyed her had no idea it had lit a storm in return. Time moved differently under the canopy of the sacred forest. Days bled into nights, and seasons whispered past like ghosts. Zanele no longer counted time by moon cycles or village drums. She marked it by power. By how long she could hold her breath under the river without drowning. By how long she could keep her hand over open flame without flinching. By how easily she could now summon sparks with a single breath. Maziwa was relentless, a teacher as old as the soil and as unyielding. She taught Zanele how to listen, not with ears, but with spirit, how to feel the heartbeat of fire in her chest, how to stir the wind with her voice and command the earth beneath her bare feet. At night, they chanted over fire pits, the smoke painting symbols in the air. By day, Zanele practiced in silence, her hands glowing with raw, untamed energy. Her scars never faded. Her face remained marked by the fire that once destroyed her, but it no longer defined her. Where once she had wept in front of water bowls, now she looked into her reflection with steady eyes. The villagers would no longer call her beautiful, but now they would call her powerful. They would speak her name with fear, not pity. One night, after a particularly grueling ritual, Maziwa sat beside the flames, her bony fingers weaving herbs into a charm. Her eyes flicked towards Zanele. "You carry more than the pain of fire," she said quietly. "There's a shadow deeper inside you." Zanele tilted her head. "I know what they did to me. I remember everything." "No," Maziwa said. "This shadow is older." The old woman threw bones into the fire. They cracked and hissed, dancing in the embers. She closed her eyes and began to chant. The fire pulsed with strange rhythm, casting visions in the smoke, faces, whispers, a storm. Zanele watched, drawn forward until the image became clear. Her mother, lying in a bed, sweat beading on her forehead, eyes glazed not with illness, but with poison. Zanele gasped. Maziwa's voice was cold and steady. She did not die of sickness. The vision shifted. It showed Lindiwe, Nomvula's mother, grinding dark roots into powder, slipping them into tea, smiling sweetly as she offered the cup. The truth seared deeper than any flame ever had. Zanele staggered back, breath caught in her throat. She killed her. Maziwa nodded solemnly, and took her place, because your mother's presence stood in the way of what she wanted, status, power, and control over your father. Zanele's hands clenched, flames crackling between her fingers. First they took her mother, then they disfigured her. Then they tried to erase her completely. But she had risen. not as a victim, but as a storm. "Let them have their crown," Zanele whispered, voice low and fierce. "I'll bring fire to their throne." Maziwa smiled for the first time in moons. "Then it is time. Let the fire awaken." And in the heart of the forest, surrounded by spirits and flame, Zanele's transformation neared completion. The sun rose over Kwatile with golden warmth, casting its light over fields thick with ripe maize and dancing sorghum. The village buzzed with energy. Children rehearsed dances, women painted their faces, and drums echoed through the morning air. The harvest festival had arrived, a time of gratitude, offerings, and celebration. But this year, it carried something else. A whisper, a rumour, a presence. A stranger had come to Kwatile. She wore a deep indigo cloak trimmed with beads and feathers. Her face was partially covered by a patterned veil, and her eyes gleamed with firelight even in the day. She said little, walked slowly, and watched everything. People moved aside as she passed. Chickens squawked and fled. The winds stirred strangely in her presence. No one recognized her. Not the women who once braided her hair. Not the boys who once trailed behind her like shadows. Not even her father, whose eyes now looked aged with grief, and whose spirit had withered under Lindiwe's quiet rule. The girl who had once wept beside the hearth was gone. Zanele had returned, but not as Zanele. She called herself Mbali Wamoto, the flower of fire. She made no grand entrances, no threats. Instead, she began with quiet purpose. A young boy caught stealing maize was spared punishment when she stood before the elders and pointed out the empty pots in his mother's hut. That night, food appeared on their doorstep, hot and fresh. When a drunken trader raised his hand to a weaver girl, he was found the next morning with blisters on his palm, muttering about dreams of flame. People began to whisper that she was sent by the ancestors, a spirit in flesh. Some said she was a guardian, others, a curse. Lindiwe and Nomvula watched with growing unease. This stranger, cloaked and strange, drew attention wherever she went. Her presence made Nomvula's skin crawl, like some long-forgotten secret was being stirred from its grave. Zanele watched them in return. She saw how Nomvula smiled too wide at the prince, how Lindiwe walked the village like she already wore a crown. But Zanele did not strike yet. No, fire did not rage without purpose. It smouldered. It waited. She planted seeds of justice in silence. A corrupt elder who had been stealing grain from the storehouse found it mysteriously emptied, replaced with ashes. A widow cheated out of her land suddenly found the village chief willing to reconsider the borders. The cowardly and cruel began to grow afraid. No one dared challenge her. No one knew her name. But the children began to call her Imvula Yomlilo, the rain of fire. And every night, Zanele returned to the edge of the forest where the old path met the trees and whispered thanks to Maziwa. She was not done. The heart of the storm had yet to strike, but the village had been warned. Fire had returned to Kwatile, and this time it would not be burned away. The final day of the harvest festival shimmered with music, colour and celebration. The village square was alive, people danced, drums thundered, and the air was thick with the smell of roasted meat and marula beer. Prince Thabani sat at the head of the gathering beneath a decorated canopy, his gaze occasionally falling on Nomvula, who stood beside him like a queen already crowned. But the joy was uneasy. The air carried something different that day, tense, waiting like the sky before a storm. And then she came. The stranger, Mbali Wamoto, walked into the square with the slow grace of a hunter. Her indigo cloak trailed behind her, her veil shimmering in the light. The crowd parted without knowing why, their cheers fading to murmurs, then silence. Zanele's voice rang out, not loud but clear enough to quiet drums and dancing. Today, We give thanks for the harvest, but how can a village truly celebrate when its roots are rotting? Lindy was stiffened. Nomvula's smile faltered. I have watched long enough, Zanelli continued. I have seen truth buried under lies, innocence burned by envy, and power stolen by poison. Gasps fluttered through the crowd. She pulled back her veil. A sharp inhale swept the village like wind before a firestorm. Some stepped back in disbelief. Others clutched their mouths. The scars, the eyes, the voice. Zanele, her father whispered from the crowd, his eyes welling. Lindy took a step forward, her voice trembling. This is witchcraft. She's supposed to be dead. Zanele's eyes burned. That's what you wanted, isn't it? She raised her hands and fire coiled in her palms, glowing like molten gold. Sparks danced around her, humming with ancestral power. The ground beneath her feet warmed. I call upon the spirits of truth, she said, to reveal what has been hidden. Wind howled. The flames around her swirled in a spiral, and the sky darkened. A voice not hers echoed through the square, old and deep, full of judgment. Lindy screamed as firelight wrapped around her like chains. Nomvula fell to her knees, sobbing. Tell them, Zanella commanded. Magic pulsed. Lindy's lips trembled. Then the truth poured out, not by choice but by the force of ancestral justice. I poisoned her mother, she confessed, tears running down her face. I wanted her gone. I wanted to be the wife. I made Nomvula do it. I told her to burn the girl. I told her. The crowd cried out in shock. Thabani rose to his feet, staring at Nomvula, who wailed as she admitted her role, voice cracking under the weight of the truth. I did it. I burned her. I was jealous. I thought if she was gone, I would be loved instead. Zanele's body glowed with fire. Her voice was thunder. You took everything from me, but I rose from ash, and now I burn the lies. With a roar, she thrust her hands toward the sky, and flames erupted around her, not destructive but cleansing. The air shimmered. The festival decorations, the false symbols of joy, went up in harmless firelight. Lindiwe and Nomvula collapsed in the center of the square, stripped of their illusions. Silence fell. Then Thabani stepped forward and bowed his head. To survive what you did, to return with power and mercy, you are more than a queen. Zanele didn't smile. Her eyes were still burning. I didn't come back for a crown, she said. I came back for truth. And Kwatile, trembling, finally saw her for what she had become, not just the girl who was wronged, but the woman who rose in fire. The flames had danced with purpose, but fire once loosed has no master. What began as a righteous cleansing twisted into chaos. Sparks caught on thatched roofs, a gust of wind carried embers to storage huts, igniting dried harvests. Smoke coiled into the sky as villagers screamed, scattering with buckets and cloths soaked in water. Children cried, livestock broke free, and the drums of celebration turned to the pounding of panic. Zanele stood still in the center of it all, her arms lowered, her eyes wide. She hadn't meant for this. Her fire had obeyed her, but the rage she'd carried, the pain she'd buried so deep, had erupted beyond control. She watched in horror as flames swallowed the edges of the market stalls, as homes burned that had no place in her vengeance. Innocents, elders, children, her people. She had come back for justice, but justice like fire had no favorites. By the time the last flame was drowned, the sun had long vanished behind smoke and ash. What remained was ruin, blackened wood, scorched fields, and a village changed forever. Zanele sat at the edge of the square, hands trembling, soot clinging to her skin. Her power, once a source of strength, now felt like a curse again. The villagers didn't speak to her. They didn't thank her. They didn't curse her either. They simply looked away. The truth had been revealed. The wicked had fallen. But the cost. It hung heavy in the air like the last curls of smoke. Then came the soft crunch of footsteps. Maziwa emerged from the shadows, her presence as silent as ever, eyes glowing faintly with the wisdom of 100 lifetimes. She said nothing at first, only looked at the destruction around them. Zanella raised tired eyes. I wanted justice, not this. Maziwa's voice was quiet but firm. Revenge never burns alone. It consumes what it touches. Guilt, innocence, memory, hope. You lit the match, child. But the wind belongs to no one. Zanelle dropped her gaze, voice barely above a whisper. Did I become like them? No, Maziwa said. But you forgot. Justice is a blade that must be sharp and guided. You let pain hold the hilt. Zanelle closed her eyes. She had dreamed of this day for so long, of truth revealed, of wrongs made right. But now the weight of it crushed her. I can't stay here, she murmured. Not after this. Maziwa nodded slowly. Then go. But go with eyes open. Your story is not finished. There is more to rebuild than destroy. Zanelle stood, the earth still warm beneath her bare feet. She looked at the village, her village, and then at the path leading back to the forest. She didn't know where she would go or what would come next, but she knew one thing. The fire inside her had not died. It had simply changed. And as dawn broke through the haze, Zanelle walked away. Not as a girl seeking vengeance, but as a woman carrying the burden of fire and the wisdom to wield it. The village of Kwatile lay in ruins, but from the ashes there was life. The people worked side by side, their hands calloused with effort, their faces marked by the reality of what had been lost. The flames had taken much, but they had also laid bare the truth, and in that rawness there was a strength that would not be extinguished. The elders gathered in the square, now a place of solemn reflection. The harvest was ruined, homes turned to charred remnants, but there was a new spirit among the people. They spoke not only of rebuilding huts and sowing crops, but of rebuilding themselves, of returning to the ways of old, of respecting the forces of nature, and above all, of honouring truth. The power of justice had been proven in flame, and they would no longer turn a blind eye to corruption or cruelty. Thabani returned to the village soon after the fire's last embers cooled. He was not the young prince who once eyed beauty and power, but a man who had seen the price of lies. He had watched the truth unfold, horrified by what had been hidden for so long, yet captivated by the woman who had brought it to light. He found Zanelle by the river, her back turned as she always had been. Her scars were a map of suffering, but they had not broken her spirit. Instead, they had woven her into something unshakable. I came to find you, Thabani said, his voice steady but unsure. Not for your beauty, but for the strength of your soul. Zanelle didn't turn. She had nothing left to prove. You don't understand, she replied, her voice heavy with the weight of her journey. I am not the woman you think I am. I have been burned, broken, and rebuilt by fire. I will never be the same. Thabani stepped closer, his gaze sincere. That is why I seek you. Not as the girl I once admired, but as the woman who has faced the flames and emerged stronger. You carry something that cannot be taken. Truth, honour, power. I wish to stand with you. Zanelle met his gaze then, the fire in her eyes unchanged, even after all she had endured. I do not need a prince, she said quietly, her voice firm with resolve. But I need justice. I need to be more than a ghost of vengeance. I will protect those who cannot protect themselves, and I will fight for those whose voices have been silenced. I will become a guardian, not a queen. Thabani bowed his head, respecting her decision, and stepped back. Zanelle had found her path, and it was not to be defined by the past, but by what she would create in the future. As she walked away from the river, she felt a calmness within her. The fire still burned, but now it was controlled. A fire that would guide her, not consume her. She would no longer be defined by revenge. She would be defined by her strength, her justice, and her unyielding spirit. And so, the village of Kwatile began to heal, not with the rebuilding of walls, but with the restoration of truth. She was not just burned, she became the fire.